Okay, so this is a case study analysis of the case called Siemens ShareNet Building a Knowledge Network. It's about the knowledge management system that was developed and implemented at Siemens called ShareNet. Now, the case describes the development and implementation of this entire knowledge management system that was actually focused on the sales and marketing function of Siemens' information and communication network group, because Siemens is obviously a huge conglomerate and tech company. Anyway, so it focuses on the choices made to overcome different problems that these networks face, and specifically that knowledge exists in multiple forms, that is tacit and codified, and it needs to therefore be made into a format and put into a format and managed in a manner that could be useful for the rest of the organization. Plus, the information is context specific. It is based on a certain scenario, and only then does it make sense. It is hard to measure in terms of quality and value because it depends on what can be gained from it, or what can be gained from decisions made on the basis of that knowledge, obviously. And the cost and benefits to its codification and transfer fall upon the network participants asymmetrically, which means different for everyone. So Siemens solved these problems through an innovative set of network design choices that created incentives for participants to contribute to and use the network, and provided an architecture through which their contributions could be captured into that system. They could be utilized, and that actually resulted in maximization of the value to the organization of this knowledge. The case also actually talks about the mechanism by which the firm bootstrapped the network, which is to overcome the classic chicken and egg problem, which is the fact that network has no value without a certain critical mass of users and content. The basic argument of the Metcalfe's law, that a network is only as useful as n times square, which means where n is the number of users. So it is only going to be useful if there is more information in it, but people will only put in more information, only use it when there is information in it. So getting that critical mass, which is bootstrapping, which is to give it that boost in the beginning, which is to start it in the beginning, to give that jump, that push to make it start, is what they overcame. So that hence the chicken and the egg problem. So by mid 2002, 4 years after its birth, Siemens network had more than 19,000 subscribers, close to 100% participation basically, and over 20,000 knowledge objects, which means pieces of codified knowledge that is actually put into the system. That was put into the system, it was deposited into the system, and between 100 to 200 urgent requests, that is problems that participants broadcast to the network, put up to the whole network, and asked them to actually help with. So were actually put up there and were being answered each month. People putting up questions that were being answered each month. Anyways, so in the prior year, the network had played a vital role in winning or executing 27 different contracts representing 120 million euros of revenue. So in sum, it was actually one of the most successful of its type, a fact that was recognized by several independent awards as well. And the case actually talks about the various choices and the various network choices made by this organization, Siemens, that led to the success. So the case is set in July 2002 against a situation where there's a downturn in the industry because of obviously the dot-com bubble burst. Corporate expenses were coming under the increasing scrutiny because of that, so they were trying to cut costs, and ShareNet had to justify its existence, which was very tough given that there were a lot of benefits being measured and of such networks, and it was actually very difficult to convince people to actually put in the money and the resources and the time to create it. So as one solution, the management team was considering, which was charging the 5 product divisions that use the network a sort of a per subscriber fee in order to make sense of it. Not everyone thought this was a good idea, obviously, because nobody wants to pay for anything, and that was worrying that some of the division might even opt out and they won't use it, which would mean that the overall value of the system would decrease. Now imagine, this is analogous to the situation where if people don't use Facebook, it's useless to us. So if we were to have a per subscriber fee for it, most people won't even use it. When most people won't use it, the others will leave too. So it's a very difficult situation. So anyways, the challenge therefore was to articulate the benefits of the network, as I've already mentioned earlier, and specifically the ways that it actually creates value for the firm. Anyways, so the case has a very compelling ending or epilogue, providing a lot of insights into the nature of the network design itself. So the ending of the case is very interesting in that way, and it talks a lot about how the overall network design was created. So in December 2002, a major cost-cutting program led Siemens to consider changing one element of this design, which is specifically the novel incentive scheme established for ShareNet, in which shares were actually awarded to participants for their contributors could be and that could be redeemed for rewards. So they were given shares in the company that they could redeem of sorts. So at this time, no shares had been redeemed, leading some managers to believe that they were valued as a measure of status rather than economic worth. So nobody was actually redeeming them. Hence, a proposal was made to withdraw the ability to cash in shares for rewards and replace this with a system that gave recognition to the top share winners. So when you win those shares, you would actually get recognition. The case actually talks about how this decision impacted the entire system. So, and to see its impact, when it was actually implemented. So network contributions declined by 60 to 90%. When they actually changed the cashable share system into a non-cashable share system, a lot of people stopped contributing to the system at all. So this dramatic result serves to actually understand and point out the critical elements of a network's design, the choices that can be made in each of these elements, and how these choices fit together to actually create value. So there are various reasons why this particular case needs to be actually studied. It has several reasons to actually be studied. It is actually there to teach you about the challenges that are associated with developing a knowledge management network that presents that is in use in a lot of firms, including the fact that knowledge actually exists in different forms, tacit and codified, and it is context specific, it's hard to measure, and the cost and benefits of those codification transfer of all falls upon the participants themselves. Plus, there's also the free rider problem that needs to be dealt with. Free rider basically means there are people who don't even contribute anything and they're just using the system. We do that all the time. Furthermore, the scaling of such a network can be very difficult, given that it has no value without a critical mass. So making sure that there is enough knowledge put in the beginning for it to actually gain that critical mass so that it boosts up and it actually exponentially expands after that and scales up is a very crucial factor. So the dynamics caused by the complex interplay between network effects and the operational issues and the perception of the network's value are what you need to understand. And you could relate this with a lot of other knowledge management systems in organizations and similar network-based systems, which have the same dynamics, like Facebook does, or other networks such as Uber and Careem do, or several other places like Wikipedia does, several other wiki pages like that. Anyways. So the second real reason to understand this case is to understand a set of network design decisions that can be overcome, that can overcome such challenges, some problems. Specifically, how Siemens network addresses these four important factors. That is, it creates incentives for participation, provides an architecture, a design to facilitate people to put in their participation, to put in their contributions into a valuable form. It possesses mechanisms for selecting among those diverse contributions the best ones, and possesses mechanisms for actually integrating those contributions into a larger knowledge base. More focus is given to the first two, which is the incentive structure in the case, the incentive structure and the system architecture itself, since obviously these are very important in the scenario that we're looking at. Also, it can be achieved, a lot of results can be achieved and understood based on the design choices that are made and how they align with the network performance. So you can learn that in this case as well. Also, it is about the process of designing and implementing the knowledge management network. More specifically, the design process actually helped their efforts to succeed, and which is the chicken and egg problem that we just talked about. And the other problem is about how the kind of strategies that actually they created to overcome that problem, the chicken and egg problem, which is to start with some knowledge to be useful in the first place for other people to contribute more to it. Anyways, and fourthly is to explore how the economic benefits of knowledge management systems can actually be measured, which is very difficult. Making sense of why such a knowledge management system actually can help is the harder part. So the challenge comes from the fact that the cost of such networks in terms of time and money are tangible, readily visible, and immediate in nature, while the benefits can be difficult to quantify. I mean, we don't know when somebody will use some information out of this present in this knowledge base and actually make some useful decisions or even create new products. So Siemens actually tracks the extra revenues and cost savings that come from the past use of this network. So its ability to predict future benefits actually rests on a lot of dubious assumptions. So they're just assuming that it will be more useful in the future. It may not be. So it's very hard to do that. The case actually helps us understand how such a calculation is actually possible. Anyways, so there are some questions within the case that can, once answered, can lead to a better understanding of the case itself. So I'll deal with those questions one by one. So in July 2002, ShareNet's managers faces some difficulty when making decisions with regards to the future of this initiative, and they brought about a lot of downturn in the telecom industry, and subsequently they needed to do a lot of cost cutting, because then this downturn is of course linked with the dot-com bubble burst that happened in 2000 and 2001. So the first question is, what are the difficulties associated with the developing of a knowledge management network, and why are such such efforts so hard to realize? And let's deal with that. The second question is about what has made ShareNet so successful, what are the biggest challenges that it faces going forward, and how should those be addressed. And thirdly, how should the ICN's 5 product divisions be charged? ICN is of course the internal communication networks of Siemens, actually be charged to use ShareNet. Should they even be charged? Should they not be charged? And if not, if so, how so? So that's how it is going to be handled in the entirety of my analysis. So let's move on now to the case analysis, and the entire case analysis is divided into several parts. First, we're going to look at the challenges that are associated with developing an entire knowledge management system in general. Then we're going to talk about how Siemens' network design actually happened, and paying more attention more specifically to the architecture for the participation that they created that actually convinced people to actually give their contributions. It also provided the incentive structure that they created. We're also going to talk about that, and the process through which the network was designed and actually implemented. And then we will then be talking about the performance of this network and comparing its cost of operations with the benefits that you gain out of it. Finally, we'll then be handling how ShareNet's managers actually faced all of those issues of these 2 issues during 2002. So obviously, first the decision was made whether to charge the product divisions per user fees, and second, a decision that arose 6 months later concerning whether to withdraw the network's incentive scheme in response to the industry's downturn that happened. So we're going to talk about all of those things. The case also talks about and actually makes us think about the complex issues based on and linked with the rollout of the entire network into different functional areas, and the extension of the ShareNet network itself to include the transfer of people from one location to another called People ShareNet. So all of these will be discussed while we actually do the entire analysis of this case. So first we're going to talk about why is knowledge management so hard in itself? Why is it so difficult in general to manage knowledge of any given organization? So what exactly is the reason why knowledge management is so hard? So the design of any knowledge management network must address 4 different classes of problems to actually be considered successful. First, it must allow the capture and transfer of multiple types of knowledge, okay, and there are lots of categories. Given that knowledge exists in multiple forms, the most common discrimination is between codified knowledge, that is knowledge that is transmittable in formal systematic language, sometimes called explicit knowledge, which is written down, is in documents, it can easily be understood and transfer from one person to another, one generation to another, one system to another. And tacit knowledge, which cannot actually be written down, it's experiential, you feel it, you experience it, and it is hence only transmittable either through training or coaching or through verbal interactions with the people who have experienced it. Now the need to capture both comes from the fact that not only knowledge can be codified, neither that not all knowledge can actually be codified, and neither is it actually desirable or even cost effective and efficient to actually do so. So hence, knowledge management networks must address both types of knowledge to actually be successful. The second problem that knowledge management systems must overcome relates to the difference between data and information and knowledge. Put simply, data consists of raw observations and measurements. Information adds context and meaning to these data, and knowledge represents the ability to put this information to use, in other words, to answer the question of how to. Now, if you recall, in the very first class, I actually discussed precisely this issue. That the difference between these 3, and wisdom, the 4th one, is actually gained over time once you have made effective usage of this knowledge. Now, many of these knowledge management networks comprise of systems that actually allow users to share reports, presentation, charts, spreadsheets, and other written documents, but without any kind of commentary or process through which to extract useful information out of these documents, or out of these documents and these abstract documents into a higher state. They remain information and not really knowledge, so you can't really use them to make any decisions. Now, knowledge management systems really succeed in elevating information to any kind of state of knowledge on their own. The third problem that knowledge management networks must overcome is the free rider phenomena. which is that users have a strong incentive to use the network to obtain the benefits, but have little incentive to actually share something. So how do you convince people to give knowledge back to the system, and the cost involved in that entire operation? So in order to maximize the value created by a knowledge management network, a design must be found that provides incentive for users to both participate and contribute to the network, to the work of the network itself. Now these incentives can actually take two different forms: either rewards for participation or punishment for not participating. Now to give you again another analogy, Wikipedia, in the case of Wikipedia, 95% of people who actually use Wikipedia just use it for the information. They don't contribute. Barely 5% do. So that's an example right there for you. Anyways, the final problem of knowledge management networks that knowledge management networks actually face and needs to be overcome is that of implementation itself, and particularly that of scaling. So specifically, these networks need to provide little value until there is a critical mass of users and content, and then after that critical mass has been reached, these networks can become self-sustaining and self-feeding, and they can grow exponentially and extremely quickly. And there's a lot of positive externalities to the membership. That is, each new member actually makes the entire system more valuable to everybody else, and it encourages greater use of the network itself. Thus it attracts more users. So it's a Metcalfe's law. So the more useful it is, the more people are attracted to it. The more people are attracted to it, they use it even more, and then those people attract more people, and hence the cycle goes on. It's like a viral loop, hence the network effect, hence the Metcalfe's law. Anyways, so in designing a knowledge management network, a thought must be put into the entire process through which the network is actually scaled up and it reaches this critical mass. So the issue of design for implementation is actually the basic issue that is also discussed in this case as well. Now, as we already discussed, the second part of this analysis therefore talks about Siemens network design choices itself. So Siemens made a lot of series of network design choices to overcome each of these problems described that we talked about and described earlier. So these design choices relate to four critical elements of any kind of collaboration network needs to address, which is creating incentives for participation, providing an architecture for participation, establishing mechanisms for selecting the kind of information required that needs to be put in, and establishing mechanisms for integrating it with other systems. So these choices are discussed one by one, and each one of them is actually going to be covered and talked about. So providing an architecture for participation, which is to create an entire system that allows various people to actually participate and to contribute different forms of knowledge into the system. So the first step that Siemens took in the design of its network was to ensure that it actually possessed a system architecture that captured different types of knowledge, both codified and tacit form of knowledge, so both implicit as well as explicit information. As one of the implementation teams actually described it in this way, which said that most knowledge management systems focus on a codified knowledge which can easily be transferred from one database to another, which are reports, documents, stuff like that. They however omit the entire consideration for tacit or experiential based or experience based knowledge, which is far more commonly transferred through social interactions like meetings and phone calls, video conference, but this is actually very much more useful as a knowledge. Anyways, but one is no good without the other. You need both. Both types of knowledge need to be transferred in order to make a truly useful knowledge sharing process to actually happen. And so in this case, there was a design goal to capture both elements, which is both parts of the knowledge. So Siemens operationalized this requirement by actually dividing the system into several discrete components, discrete parts. Two were of critical importance. First was the knowledge that could be codified and written in graphical form, and it could actually be used independently of the contributor. Whoever was giving the information, they didn't need to talk about it, discuss it, or even clarify it even further. It could be used once they are already given it. So it was captured in what were called as knowledge objects and stored in a knowledge library or a knowledge base. And the second a method was established to allow participants to transfer knowledge that had not been or could not be codified to establishing direct person-to-person contact. This was the urgent request section of the knowledge management network, in which the problems were actually broadcast to the network and people would then answer. This is very similar to today's Quora and Reddit, where people actually post questions and other people answer. Several Facebook pages exist for the same thing, where questions are asked by people and then they're answered by the remaining members who are part of that system. Anyway, so urgent requests are like asking the whole world for help. You don't know where the answer will be coming in from, right? So for example, in one case, an ICL project manager in South America was trying to find out how dangerous it was to lay cable in the Amazon rainforest. So he wanted advice on the type of insurance that the project would need. The manager then sent out this urgent request. He was asking if anybody had any kind of experience of a similar network, a similar situation or a challenge. and if somebody could answer. So there was a project manager who worked in Senegal, and he encountered a similar situation and was able to respond to this, and this information actually helped save a lot of money, and the right kind of insurance was therefore taken before the project in the Amazonian rainforest was started. Plus, the next time the manager had a similar problem, he knew who to consult first. So this was helpful in that way. So the second step that Siemens took in the design of its network was to ensure that it captured knowledge and not just information or data. So in contrast to typical knowledge management efforts, which actually focus on which are just document databases, just have files and folders in them. So Siemens were proactively codifying participants' knowledge using an interactive question answer process, and they were asking more questions and getting more answers and putting them in. So the results were stored in a knowledge library, or what is now known as a knowledge base, designed by the network users themselves. The library defined the specific nature and type of the knowledge that was useful to the network's participants themselves. The process provided a method to help participants turn this information into knowledge. One of the people discussed in the case, Manuth, actually noted that it was important to give people the opportunity to explain their experiences that they gained in the field and describe the solution that they came up with in facing different problems. So we were actually anxious to avoid this becoming another typical knowledge management tool failure, which is like just being a document repository. And they didn't want it to be like just something that was talked about but never actually happened. So they needed to capture some of the tacit knowledge that managers had in their heads, that they had experienced, that they had felt, and the real life tests of the pros and cons of a different solution. So they had to go and ask these questions from managers, and they wouldn't necessarily be thinking about just completing a particular project document or anything. They were actually trying to get more answers to different questions that could potentially be asked. So it was explicitly designed to be handled like an interactive medium and be used in that way. So then there was the issue of creating incentives for participation. Okay. The next step that Siemens actually took in the design of its network was to create incentive for participants to actually contribute to this system, to actually give information into this system. And that was an important, crucial aspect as well. So they wanted participants to contribute and use the network at the same time. The incentive system intended to actually overcome the issue of free riders, which is to say that people who actually use the system but never actually contribute back to it. Very similar to the torrenting system too, where we actually leech and download files but never upload them, we never seed them, we stop seeding. Same thing, free rider problem. So but it actually but also aimed to attack a potentially larger problem at Siemens as well, which is the negative perception over the reuse process, which is that the firm was actually more of a creative kind of solver. So looking at this knowledge base was considered, and for solutions was thought of as being reusing information. So a ShareNet manager called Gerhard Hischler actually said that this is a firm of creative technical problem solvers. Using an already existing solution to actually solve your own unique problem was considered to be negatively considered. It wasn't actually considered acceptable. When on the contrary, they should have thought about it in a manner that this was preventing the reinvention of the wheel. But that was the organizational culture. They thought it was insulting to actually use someone else's solution instead of coming up with your own. So the incentive scheme that Siemens actually created was adapted over time as the company learned more about the impact of its design choices. A natural process and a natural approach was taken, given the inherent uncertainty over several different aspects of the scheme itself. Specifically at whom the incentive should be targeted, that is the users themselves or the managers of these users. The types of incentives they should be that would work best. For example, the prize that the winner would get, would it be rewards in proportion to the participants' contribution, or will it be a general reward, general for any kind of contribution? And the way these incentives could be used to actually shape those contributions. Example, would you encourage high quality contributions by having a better higher reward, or just have the same reward throughout, or whether there will be a feedback rating of those contributions where people who use that knowledge, whatever you've contributed, and they would and the kind of feedback they give would determine the kind of rewards that should be given back in return to the original contributors. So they had to think about all of those things. So the incentive scheme that emerged from this entire experimentation process of choosing whether the reward would be based on a general number, or whether it be based on how people were using the information, whatever it may be. So it came from this experimentation process, and that they would be awarded shares, and these users would be awarded shares for their contribution, and they would be weighted by the usefulness of the contribution that they made. So based on the usefulness of the contribution, they would be given various types of shares. More shares if your contribution was more useful, lesser if it was not so useful. So, and that rating would come from the users themselves. Anyways, so who then of course receive shares for giving those ratings in themselves, because even that in itself is a contribution. So anyways, shares could be redeemed for a variety of tangible rewards, which have been mentioned in cases exhibit 7. Anyways, the impact of this incentive scheme was actually quite dramatic. This was best seen by the effect that limited time promotions had on the network's contribution, which is discussed in Exhibit 8A. For example, share awards were doubled in a certain time period from February to July 2001, and as a result, contributions increased over 300%, as mentioned in the case, is page 9. Manuth actually commented that we were extremely surprised that none of us actually expected this kind of response. They didn't realize that having a reward system based on the shares would actually be such a huge incentive for people. So by experimenting with its network design choices, Siemens found a powerful managerial lever with which they could shape and influence the ongoing network activity. In other words, they found the trigger. They knew how to convince people to contribute more to the system if they wanted. Furthermore, we need to also examine the awards and its economic perspective. In this respect, the case actually provides relevant data on cases page 9, which says that contributing a success story earned 20 shares. A project, a technical solution, or a service, or a functional solution component also earned 20 shares. So technology objects or market or customer objects earned 10 shares. A share was worth around €1. That's mentioned on case page number 9. Anyways, the effort to input data, for example, on a completed project took an hour, maybe 2 hours at worst. So putting these observations together, we find that a contributor's time is actually rewarded at €20 per hour or lower. This seems surprisingly low, given that the participants are technical sales staff who would be paid a far higher salary. So 1 hour that they would spend in contributing is actually being rewarded for less amount than, say, putting that same hour into their work. Anyways, so while it represents an incremental revenue to a network user, so maybe they could do it after work hours, it is in effect a bonus on top of their salary. So it is still somewhat surprising that such a small incentive has such a large effect. So consider that it took many contributions to come within reach of a reward which started at, say, 400 shares. Anyways, there is, however, a different hypothesis for the impact of the incentive scheme itself. Rather than being valued for their economic benefits, shares might be viewed as a measure of status among network members. So they could boast about it, they could talk about it. So indeed, the case suggests that ShareNet actually put peer pressure to work, which is that details of all members, including all their contribution and the level of usefulness, was viewed by everybody in the system. So they would know how much their co-workers have contributed. They could even comment about it. They could boast about it. So that was a social currency of sorts. So anyways, it serves as an incentive to sharing our knowledge with our. Furthermore, one user actually said regarding this, he says, receiving some award naturally serves as an incentive to sharing our knowledge with colleagues worldwide, but it is not the most important aspect. Getting direct recognition from how much our daily job is appreciated is the most important thing. That's what actually counts and motivates us, which is mentioned in case 8, page number 8. Anyways, so finally, while 300 users were in reach of an award, surprisingly, no one had yet redeemed any shares for those prizes. So you could actually, cash them in, but nobody did, and that's mentioned in case page number 12. These observations are critical to what is about to happen, which is that they would remove the cash-in, method, because they realized nobody was cashing it in. Anyways, so designing mechanisms for selection and integration of different solutions into the knowledge management system. The next step that Siemens took in the design of its network was to establish mechanism for selecting among those diverse contributions of participants and integrating these contributions into a coherent whole, that is, in this case, a solution. This is not a central feature in the case that we are talking about. A knowledge management network is actually self-governed. It's a loosely coupled system. It's not connected in that way, but as such, the selection integration actually occurs mainly by the participants themselves. So what they do is they choose which one is the right solution, and they identify it as something that they use it more often. Automatically it becomes the chosen solution. For example, when an urgent request is posted, there may be several replies, since it is up to the seeker of that information to identify what is the best solution, and they do so. So in a similar manner, a search of the library may reveal a number of useful knowledge objects, but selection is again made by the seeker themselves. So in both cases, the seeker must integrate the knowledge from the network to actually come up with the solution. So they do it on their own anyway, the people who are seeking the solution. So Siemens did provide some central resources to aid the effective solution selection and integration of those knowledge into solutions themselves. For example, ShareNet assigned a global editor to monitor the quality of the objects submitted by people, so they could moderate it, and eliminating those from the system that were not up to the minimum standard of a solution. Furthermore, the editor had responsibility for editing the content objects into a more reusable, that is abstract form, ensuring that they had greater value to potential users. Finally, this editor or moderator had responsibility for patrolling the system to identify objects that overlap. So if some multiple people had put up the same solution, it would remove the redundant ones, the extra ones, the overlapping ones, and it would address and remove the ones that are repeating themselves, and just keep one of those. So in this case, the editor would then select the right ones, so to speak, the best ones. This is mentioned in page number 7 in the case. So the process of designing and implementing a knowledge management network is the next issue that we'll be discussing. So while the discussion has already gone through 4 of those critical factors that must be considered in the design of a knowledge management network, Siemens also needed to pay attention to the process through which these design choices were actually made, as well as the manner in which the networks are actually implemented. So in this respect, there were 2 critical features that actually helped Siemens succeed in their efforts. First was the strategy of directly involving the users that were likely to be depending on the network the most themselves. Those that are part of the periphery of the firm, which is far from the main head office. They were working in branches in other countries and other cities. So, and secondly, the set of strategies adopted in order to start the network, bootstrap the network, so that it could reach that critical mass. So both of these were critical aspects, reaching those lesser known branches people, as well as gaining the critical mass in the beginning. So with respect to the first of these issues, which is the beginning of the initiative, ShareNet's managers focused on users who had the most need for such a system, those who were away from the headquarters, and therefore they would need more information, they would need more help. So overseas locations obviously do not have access to walking up to someone and asking a question, who would have probably more experience. So hence these were the ones who were selected for involvement in the beginning. So there were 2 ways we could go about deploying the technology. We could actually do it in the headquarters, which was in Munich, Germany, or they could roll it out to the rest of the company across the globe. So they had plenty of experience in doing that. That's the typical Siemens way. They actually had a lot of failures, but they also had a lot of successes where they would implement it in several locations. So they could go into the field and ask people, how should we do this? And that's what they tried to do. That's how they were doing things. That's their way of approaching the various problems. This is also mentioned on cases page number 5. So Munich, which is where the headquarters are, has all the power, and the local network there gives you all the knowledge that you need. However, if you have a problem and there's probably someone who can actually answer it, they're close by anyways. But out there, when you're in the various other branches and all, it becomes very difficult. So for example, an official hotline for engineers in the field, they could call up and get technical information from anyone. If someone is in Vietnam, they can get information through the hotline. Over and over we heard, no one ever calls me back, we're too small. So that's also a problem. People in other branches were not getting the response that they needed. So they had actually urgent requests that ShareNet actually gave them access to. They were putting it up there. Anyways, so that was one way to help them out. The second notable aspect of the implementation process was the range of strategies that Siemens adapted in the beginning to have that bootstrap, which is to gain the critical mass as quickly as possible. The 3 different strategies were particularly effective for this: running conferences in local countries to promote initial usage. 1. Recruiting well-connected and experienced team members that could resolve the request of these initial users very quickly. So they were dedicated people who were actually solving initial problems to gain their trust and to make them realize that this system is actually very useful, and establishing a ShareNet manager in each country to promote the continued usage of this. So they were like champions who would continue to convince people to keep on using it. The conferences were a particularly effective way of demonstrating ShareNet's value to those users, especially those who were like in other branches, and that was very helpful. So Manut actually explained that to jumpstart the network, they held 2 to 3 day workshops in local countries to make sure that they reach local companies on board, and they would convince them to get them to use the system and the interface, and to convince them of its value. They also had to exercise, repeat this exercise at every workshop. They would do it every time that they would go do it in different countries. At the beginning of the session, they would actually tell them that if they had a problem that is unsolved, that you let sitting around on your desk before you came here, make sure that you put it up into the system so that somebody can solve it for you or help you solve it. So without fail, by the end of the day, a lot of people would get replies and would get solutions to their problems, and they would be very stunned and they'd be happy. So this actually is working, and they were happy because obviously the hotline wasn't working. So everyone else in the room would get the idea, and then this would happen, or so on and so forth. This was mentioned in case page number 6. So at first, the core ShareNet team actually fielded these problems themselves. They handled themselves. They would then find, they would ask people around themselves to help them solve the problems and those urgent requests. They would connect, to other people who could help them solve it. Later on, the ShareNet country manager would then nominate in each country, who are nominated for each country, would actually then champion it and then continue to be the mentor and coach, supervisor, helping local local users solve their problems. And they constantly, put up solutions there. So as Hischler actually noted, you must keep track of what people are using it for. It's a little bit like a KGB activity, So from time to time, you publish statistics about your division, about how people are using it, whether they're getting the successful results or not. Then came the last idea, was to evaluate the performance of the ShareNet. There are two main ways, that this was done. One, by looking at the rate of participation relative to the number of potential participants, or those who had never participated. And by looking at the economic benefits that came from using the network in relation to the cost of its operations. So first, the idea of the number of subscribers to the ShareNet, which by July 2002 was about 19,000. This was an impressive number, given that we are told that the number of sales and marketing staff was actually a total of 17,000. When the ICN group was formed in 1998, mentioned on case page number 3, compared to that, this was a good number. So, however, not all of these subscribers are actually active participants. So, Manut noted across all of ICN, they actually calculated that about 80% of the users read ShareNet regularly but did not contribute, and only about 15% contributed once in a while, and about 5% were actually heavy contributors. This was mentioned in case page number 10. So, while the number of active participants was pretty low as compared to the proportion of the total subscriber base, this was, of course, going to happen. I already mentioned Wikipedia's case, where 95% of people who actually use it don't contribute, while only 5% do. So indeed it is actually likely that the active 5% will change over time. They will increase, they will shift in and out of projects, they'll put up more stuff. The fact is that most of the all potential network participants read ShareNet regularly. That's a good thing. So it creates significant option value in terms of the problem that these readers may be able to solve in the future. So hopefully more people will contribute. Now, the economic benefits of ShareNet that happened compared to its cost, let's talk about that. So first, we also note that Siemens actually attempted to document all the projects where ShareNet actually played a vital role in order to solve a problem. This is mentioned in case page number 13. The language that they use here is that it indicates the difficulty of verifying both the manner and degree to which ShareNet actually contributed. So it's very hard to actually trace whether a particular solution that came from ShareNet actually resulted in economic benefits or cost savings for a particular project, in that way, which is very hard to do. Anyways, so perhaps a vital piece of information about a customer or a technology might have helped to win a contract. That's easy to classify. But earlier quote actually suggests that perhaps the network helped to identify how a project should be executed after it had actually been won. In specifying the nature of insurance required for laying cables in jungle, for instance, that insurance plan thing. Anyway, so how should we actually value this advice regards to the calculating ShareNet's benefit? Obviously, there's no real answer. How could we really say whether knowing what to insure for helped us save some money or win some money? So it was very difficult to connect to, or to connect or to identify exactly how much money was saved, So anyways, so on the question of costs, we can achieve greater clarity. Specifically, the case actually provides data on several types of costs associated with the network themselves. So by the end of 2000, ShareNet costs were reported to be a total of $7.8 million. It's mentioned on case page number 7. Given that the network went live in August 99, this suggests that a cost of about $5 million per year is being incurred. So it is not exactly clear what this includes, but it actually likely includes the system development license costs as well as the direct cost of ShareNet team members, not including the country managers themselves. Number 2, ShareNet team actually comprised of Manut, 3 consultants and a global editor, and a few full-time IT resources. So about 8 full-time staff members, multiplying that by $150,000 per year, that's about a 1.2 million costs in annual usage or cost for operating this system, which is operating this knowledge management system, which is mentioned on case page number 12. So there are 53 ShareNet managers, which is mentioned on case page number 12, who on average spend about 10 to 15% of their time on ShareNet And they also receive an annual bonus of up to 120% of the monthly salary, mentioned on case page number 9, in effect a 10% bonus. So adding these two figures, we get a number of about 2 million of the costs being spent annually. So almost 400,000 shares had been awarded in 2000-2001, which cost around $400,000 because $1 for each of the shares. So on this basis, the annual cost of the ShareNet is likely to fall between two figures: a low figure of 3.6 million, including the staff plus the share costs, but excluding the software licensing cost, since it is an open source platform that they're using, and a high figure of about 7.4 million, using the 5 million run rate from above calculation that we just talked about, and plus the country manager and the share cost. So this would mean around 5.5 million. So mean costs. So the question that we need to ask is whether the benefits exceed these $5.5 million worth of cost. So we need to look at how to count the additional revenues of $120 million, which ShareNet is supposed to be claiming that it generated in 2001. So using the net margin of the firm, which is assumed to be 5% according to Exhibit 14, it makes sense that subject to variations in business cycles and various things changing, we can use this additional profit from ShareNet in 2001 as 6 million. So a figure that is relatively close to its cost. So 5.5 million was the cost, around 6 million was gained because of ShareNet's information. Indeed, it was, you could say, this is beneficial. So ultimately, the evaluation of ShareNet's cost and benefit should focus on the anticipated benefit from the system, not the value that it happens to generate in any particular year. So you can't say this year this was the cost and this is the benefit we got. We could say that this is the cost that we incurred, and eventually this information in this knowledge management will eventually help us somewhere down the line in the future, in many years later maybe. So in this aspect, it is interesting to look at Manut's valiant attempt to project future revenues, which he talks about in Exhibit 14. So there are no less than 5 critical assumptions in this model for which Manut has absolutely no data. So he says that even if the average data for these variables were available, the annual variations would make the calculations pointless. So for example, a 20% increase in each variable would be more than double the outcome. So these predictions are pretty useless, but we could see that in the future advantages would come out. So how then exactly should Siemens evaluate this network? Unfortunately, there is no real easy answer to this. So gathering data on past outcomes in a rigorous fashion is a good start, while recognizing that there is a range of different ways in which these contributions could be valued, and it could be calculated for both a net and a gross margin for additional projects. But ultimately, we must understand that the value that the network generates cannot be calculated in a quantitative way. So it's pointless in that way. So making decisions based only upon the value that we can see is actually pretty risky. So the value happens to be captured in a given year is not necessarily going to show its true value. So it may be showing in the future. So that's the case. So in other words, the benefit from the system is a potential future value that we can't even predict. Anyways. So how exactly did they decide to charge the different product divisions with regards to the usage of the ShareNet? So at the time of the case, the ShareNet managers were increasing pressure to justify, they had a lot of pressure on how to justify the costs. So they estimated that the cost is around 5.5 million that we talked about per year. So one way to do this would be to charge the 5 product divisions per user fee. Whoever uses the system will have to pay, and whichever department that user belongs to will be charged for it. So this would allow each division to work out whether the return for the ShareNet was worth the cost of providing it to their sales and marketing staff, and that way you could have more accountability of ShareNet's usage by different divisions. So given that ShareNet had been a grassroots initiative developed and promoted outside the normal processes and structures that usually had operated within these divisions, it made sense. This idea made sense, that it should be a per user charges. However, and this is what the VP Mark Viduk actually said. He says that ShareNet's founders went directly to the local country sales marketing organizations to help them out, but there are channels for the product divisions and the division heads in Munich who were not addressed and were not included in the process. This was probably the right strategy at the time. It got things done quickly, but now that we have to figure out how more closely to tie ShareNet to the divisions, to answer this question requires that we better understand where we really need ShareNet. Too many people say, I know you want me to take ShareNet, but do I really need it? Can you demonstrate how my sales guy will need it? So it was very difficult that way. So unfortunately, there are many pitfalls to this idea. First, the benefit of this type of network are asymmetric. One cannot predict exactly where those needs will arise and how it will help. So for example, in Exhibit 13, we see that projects won or executed with the help of ShareNet are in the main developing countries which are very far away from Germany and Munich, where the headquarters are. What if the product division decide not to pay for the sales staff in Germany to use the network? What if the sales department is not just in one country? What if it is spread out? So they would be like, since we use it, but the people in Munich use it too, but we don't want to pay for them. Why should we pay for them? Anyway, so given these staff did not benefit from it, so clearly the network as a whole would suffer, given that there are positive externalities to the network's membership. So a lot of people would stop using it because they are being asked to pay for someone else's usage. Anyways, furthermore, if a division opted out, the price would have to increase for the remaining divisions. So obviously, if divisions left, the price would go up for the remaining ones. So they would withdraw too, and the cycle would go on. So similar to how they would increase as members, they would even withdraw in the same way. So finally, there is a strong argument that at this early stage in the network development, it cannot be valued accurately, as there is no way to decide to price its services, or even the divisions asking to be paying for it. So these arguments suggest that ShareNet should continue to be a corporate expense, and the company should bear its costs instead of actually asking the different divisions who use it to pay for it. Then there's the Epilogue, and the ShareNet team actually proposed keeping the network as a corporate expense, justifying the decision by saying that the return on investment could be calculated based upon 2001's cost savings and additional revenues that came through it. So it played a vital role according to them. In these calculations, they used the net margin from additional revenues to get the idea of how much beneficial it was. So in late 2002, there was a further deterioration in the telecoms industry, and it was suffering because of the dot-com bubble burst and several other problems. So senior management at ICN was like, let's lay off 30% of the group staff. And during this time, they were like, ShareNet managers was forced to look at the cost, and they need to cut the cost because obviously the company needed to cut the cost. It could no longer bear the expenses of the ShareNet. So one suggestion was that emerged was to withdraw the ability of network participants to redeem the shares, as mentioned in the beginning of the case. So the thinking behind this was that nobody actually bothered to redeem them. So let's just remove that status. So if the latter were true, there might be a way to give recognition to participants, who earn large enough shares, and without having the expense of the shares and rewards. So in effect, the network could move from a focus on extrinsic motivation to more of an intrinsic motivation. Okay, so the proposal was made to replace the current system with the one that recognized users who reached a certain level of share level would be called a master or an expert, and they would be given these titles instead of actually given actual shares. So alongside this, recognition would be given to the network's user of the month. They would be given their title. The financial effect was a projected annual saving of about $500,000 per year. The proposal was obviously accepted, and it was gone through. The withdrawal of the system had major impact, however. It was a negative impact. People stopped using it, and knowledge management object contribution fell by 96% in 2003 relative to 2001. The decline in urgent requests was not so high because people were still making urgent requests, but people were no longer contributing in general. So these actually, while the urgent request only fell by 61%. Anyway, so this negative response could be interpreted as suggesting that the network participant did in fact actually value the network's economic reward, but it could equally be interpreted as a reaction to the fact that the network's rules were changed without involving the participants. So they didn't realize it. Maybe they just got angry about it. So in a direct contradiction to the way that it was designed in the first place. It was designed by keeping these rewards as a system. So maybe they would have agreed to it if they were actually told about it, if they were discussed to whether this was a good idea. So the main lesson for the manager was clear: they must have a deeper understanding of the design choices that they're making. You can't just make a choice without involving the people who are the main beneficiaries of the system. So it was useful to reflect on what Siemens could have done to understand this. The problem is that there's no way of knowing the real motivations of network participants in advance. They couldn't know it. I mean, the numbers clearly said that they should do this. They did it. Anyway, so one solution was to think about the problem as one of experimental design. How could an experiment be done that would actually give Siemens enough information to understand? So there was no way to know it. Anyways, so that's one thing. So next, we also had to consider how an experiment might actually be run. I mean, there were two broad strategies that would emerge. First, the experiment with a different scheme for a limited time. For example, they could have done an experiment. They would have said, we would have a small time period where we will have a user of the month board, and another experiment could be done specific segment of the population, maybe a specific department, where they would have a different way, and maybe that way they could understand what could have been the right decision in this scenario. So yeah, that's pretty much what this decision and this entire case was about. And you need to think about the kind of difficulties that happen when you're doing knowledge management. how whether or not people actually have experience with it. In an organization, you need to look at that, how well they think that these systems work. In one of the sections I actually discussed how knowledge management, I even demonstrated a little bit of it, how they actually work, whether knowledge management is hard, why is it so hard. You need to look at that, the kind of differences that happen between different kinds of knowledges, which is codified and tacit knowledge, why we can't actually codify our knowledge, why there is a lot of tacit knowledge, and why we need them both, and how can they actually be valued. And understanding the ShareNet's network and its problems, and how they were identified, how they were resolved, how the usefulness of the system was evaluated, and how contributions were evaluated, what are the main parts of the system, how there's more knowledge captured, how people were convinced to capture more knowledge and to put in more knowledge, the incentive scheme and how useful that was, and then evaluating the overall performance, the ongoing performance of the ShareNet. Was it a success? Was it a failure? That is also again something that we need to look at. Plus, how exactly in the future this should be taken in. So yeah, obviously one of the things that they could be doing later on is to actually connect this knowledge management system with a machine learning AI based system, which could learn in real time with the information already gathered, instead of just having people contribute to it. Maybe they could still have a contributing reward, but obviously once AI is into the play, once machine learning is used to actually collect all that data, you won't really need too much of user contribution, and you won't really need to bother about having a reward system in that case. But until then, obviously you need to have a reward system, and especially in the case of tacit knowledge, you still need a reward system to keep on incentivizing people to contribute to that. So that's that for this case.